Hey everybody, and welcome to my first podcast. So, I was scrolling on YouTube the other day and I saw a post by a lady who was on a weight loss journey. I think it was My Little Realities from memory, but don't quote me on that. I'm pretty sure that was a channel though. And it was just a podcast. It was no video, it was just voices. And I was like, oh, I didn't know you could upload. I mean, of course you could upload that to YouTube, but who's going to watch it, But then I thought, well, I often listen to people's YouTube channels and don't always watch it because sometimes I just like to sit there and close my eyes and just listen. So I thought, you know what, I'm going to give that a go. I'm going to have a go at making a podcast and see if anyone listens to it. My partner and I want to actually start some conspiracy theory podcasts. Like, that would be fun, but we need to set up an area and everything to do it. So that's something that we've been talking about for a while. Excuse me, I'm just having a sip of my tea. But today I thought I would talk about something. I thought I'd talk about homeschooling because and autism, because when I started my channel, that was something that I wanted to talk about because it is something that I have dealt with in the past, and things are a lot easier now, but I still wanted to talk about it in some capacity because I wanted to put it out there in case it helps someone, just because I feel like I went through so much and had so little help that it was heartbreaking, and like I literally could have had a mental breakdown. Things were so hard, and like there isn't a lot of help out there sometimes. Sometimes we see these tragic stories on the news, and people go, well, why didn't they reach out for help? And I can tell you that sometimes when you reach out for help, you don't actually get it, which really sucks. And I'm finding that still with the NDIS in Australia, that I recently spent 6 months getting reports together with a team of treating professionals for my daughter, and we got rejected. They said, no, you don't need any further funding. And, thank goodness my daughter is doing well. Last year she was struggling. There was a lot going on in our lives, and she was struggling, and it's pretty much all been sorted now. So everything is fine. But yes, of course, as a mum with 3 children on the spectrum and 1 adult son, 1 almost adult son who still need my help and support, of course, if I had a support worker to help me, it would make my life easier. But I just have to manage my time between the children, and it means I can't go out and work. I can't do a lot of things because I always put the children first, and that's just the way it is. And, that's the way it is. So I'm not going to go to court and try to get further funding because what's the point? I don't believe it would make any difference whatsoever. I've been advised it's not a great process. It's just disappointing, like a couple of hours of support at least would have been beneficial for her. But I'm lucky that I have a supportive partner and he can help me with that. But anyway, my homeschooling journey. So I started homeschooling my eldest is 20, and I started homeschooling him when he was about in year 4, so he was about 9 or 10, and I homeschooled for 7 years. Just sipping on that tea again. And I suppose I have to go back to the start of my children's diagnosis, really. My eldest son was very bright, very intelligent. He was hitting all of his milestones early, and everyone used to say to me, oh, he's so smart. And I'd have complete strangers come up to me and say, why isn't he at school? And he was like 3, because he was talking like a 5-year-old. He was tall. Everyone thought he was 5 years old when he was 3. But then as soon as he hit school, he just couldn't cope emotionally and socially. And I was like, what is going on? Like, I've got this really smart kid and he's just gone to pieces and he can't cope with school. Like, this is crazy. Like, what is going on here? And I got divorced around about that time, and everyone's like, oh, it's just the divorce, it's just the divorce. And everyone's just blaming the divorce because, of course, that seems like the most obvious thing. Oh, he's having emotional problems because of the divorce. Anyway, things just went on and they were hard and he was struggling, and I sent him to several different schools. And it wasn't until his brother had to go to school that things started to become clear. Now, his brother had always struggled, had a lot of developmental delays and things, and complete opposite of his older brother. And he was really, really struggling. And I enrolled him into preschool when he was about 3. Yeah, he was 3. And this is such a sore point for me. It's so hurtful, but I hope this helps someone. I hope what I've been through helps other people, because it's the only way that I can make sense of why I've been through so much shit, because it wasn't fair, And so basically, I enrolled my son in the preschool, and then one day, the head of the preschool came out, the director of the preschool came out, and she said to me, how old's your son? I said, he's 3. Why? Oh, sorry, I said he's 5. No, okay, I got confused. I enrolled him when he was 5. And I said, he's 5, why? And she goes, I thought he was 3 years old. And I'm like, okay. And he was literally sitting in a chair in the foyer, and she's having this conversation with me in front of him. How inappropriate can you get? And she proceeded to tell me that I thought he was 3 years old. I had to go and check his birth certificate. And I'm like, okay. And at that point, I was getting 4 hours of sleep a night because my son wasn't sleeping. He was slamming doors, being aggressive, couldn't discipline him. He couldn't sleep, he couldn't help it. He'd sit up at night going 2 plus 2 is 4, 2 plus 2 is 4, 3 plus 2 is 5, 4 plus 4 is 8. Just sit up counting because he couldn't sleep. And, yeah, that was just such a horrible time, horrible day. And she basically told me to come into her office and she'd get a couple of other workers in. And these 2 other workers came in with folders to take notes. And I think my son must have gone back to class because I don't remember him being in there. And yeah, and they just ripped me to shreds, like just asking me all these questions and everything, and I was in tears. And like, yeah, so that's right, when I was back in the foyer after she said I had to check his birth certificate, I said, the nurse said he may be autistic. I said, but like I took him to the pediatrician and he wasn't too worried, and he's meant to have a follow-up appointment, but the pediatrician wasn't too worried. And then she was like, well, you need to get onto that, and like the way she spoke to me, she was basically implying that I had neglected him. I can't remember everything, but she was just so freaking rude about it. And then they had me in tears, interrogating me in their office, asking me 1,000,001 questions, and it was just horrendous. These days, if someone did that to me, you'd hear the expletives, you would. Like, I would just say, how dare you, like, it's terrible. But I was so vulnerable at that point. I was getting 4 hours sleep a night, and I was exhausted and emotional and desperate because I knew something was up with my son, but I had been taking him to the doctors for years and telling them all these things that were going on, and no one gave a shit. No one batted an eyelid. I said, he doesn't sleep. Oh, I'll take him home and give him a lavender bath. Oh, okay. Why didn't I think of that, So it was just really, really such a travesty and so devastating, because if he had been diagnosed earlier, he wouldn't have gotten as bad as he'd gotten. Like, he would have had early intervention, and some of that behaviour would have been he would have gotten that support and it wouldn't have gotten out of control. So it was really devastating, for him, because it set him back a lot. Anyway, so yeah, when I took him for his 4-year-old checkup, the nurse said he could be autistic. And I tell you what, I was pretty mortified. Like, I was pretty shocked, because at that point I thought that people who had autism were like Rain Man. I'd never seen the movie, but the ads for it would come on TV every year. And so that's what I thought. If you're autistic, you're like either a genius or you can't speak. So to think that my child was autistic, I was really, really mortified. Like, I just was like, this could be it. Like, he used to bang his head on the door all the time, and like to the point where I'd be like really stressed out that he was going to give himself a concussion. And like, he used to trip over his own feet because one of his feet used to turn in. He had sensory issues. He spit out his food. He talked late, like all those things. And yeah, like I had no idea. I had no clue. I didn't know anything about it, you know. Anyway, I took him to the pediatrician anyway, because that's what you do if the nurse says your child could be autistic, even though you're like, what? I still took him to the pediatrician just to make sure. And then I took him to the pediatrician, and the pediatrician said, do you think he's autistic? Now, this was a pediatrician with a good reputation, 20 or 30 years experience, and I trusted him. And he goes, do you think he's autistic? And I said, I don't know. I said, he's got some problems and some delays, but it seems okay to me mostly. Like, I didn't know what I was talking about. And then nothing sort of happened, because the pediatrician sort of looked him up and down and sort of reckoned he looked all right. And I said, oh, I think he's okay, but he's got a few problems. But I don't know, like, I just didn't know what I was talking about. And yeah, the pediatrician said, oh, we'll come back in 6 months and see how he goes, you know. And so there wasn't any great sort of hurry or rush, or no one was pressing any panic buttons. Just having some more tea. And then, yeah, like I think it was about 8 months later that conversation happened with the preschool. And they're like basically ripping into me saying, well, you need to get onto that. Like, making out like I didn't give a shit and that I wasn't doing the right thing. And it's like, it's literally just like a couple of months past. He was due back to go back a couple of months ago, and I've been getting 4 hours sleep a night. That's why I haven't taken him back, because I'm fucking exhausted. But of course I didn't say that, you know. I was just so vulnerable, and I just didn't have the capacity to stick up for myself. I was exhausted. So anyway, at least out of that confrontation, like, that did lead to my son finally getting diagnosed, because they did write me a letter of support, and I think their intentions were probably good, but I think their manner in which they did it and the way they went about it was pretty rough. It was pretty confrontational, and they didn't need to come down on me so hard, because I was not neglecting my son. But anyway, they wrote a letter back to the same pediatrician, and when I went back, he was in a really bad mood, and I think he realised that he probably should have done something 6 months earlier. But anyway, we ended up going down to Aspect in Sydney and getting a diagnosis for my son. And yes, I mean, that was good to finally have a diagnosis, but I knew before we went that he'd get diagnosed with Asperger's, because the preschool actually gave me a book on Asperger's, and I read it in one weekend, and I just cried. Like, it was like a light bulb went off in my head, because I thought, finally, I understand what's going on with my son. Like, he had about 80% of the symptoms in this checklist. He had nearly every single one, you know. And I thought, yeah, that's what it is. That finally makes sense. And then we went down and told him all the details and everything, and they came back and said, yes, you know, he's got a diagnosis of Asperger's. And I'm like, yep, I'm not surprised after reading that book and everything. And I was just so relieved. And you know, but once you get a diagnosis, that's like the first step in the journey. And it's not the end, it's just the beginning. So, and then it was this big rush to get him into a school. At the time we were living in a place, no, that's not right. I moved to a place with more schools, with more schooling options, because I was worried about him getting into a good school. And that was all for nothing as well, because like, it was a big rush to get him into a school. that a decent school that would have funding and all of this. And I was told by all the therapists, you've got to get him into this, enrolled into the school like before the start of the year, because they do all their funding now. And I did all of that, and then nothing happened. Even into the following year, I kept saying, have you applied for funding yet? Have you applied for funding yet? And then I couldn't get an answer out of them. And then finally they told me one day, so I gave up asking because I just couldn't seem to get anywhere. And finally one day they turned around and said, oh, we did apply for funding, but he got rejected. And I was like, I uprooted my life for this, and that school was absolutely effing hopeless. Like, it was a good school, but if you were different, if you had autism, they just didn't seem to give a shit. But then I knew someone else who said their sister had autism, and the school were doing the right thing by her, and that she was like, my dad's goes up there and he tells them what for and blah 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 blah. And I'm like, well, it's not like I'm not trying. So I don't know, I just had enough. You get pushed to the point, you get pushed to your breaking point, and I literally just had enough. And the point came towards, I think, the end of the year, I think it was the end of the year. I had both the boys there. I can't remember how long they were there for. I think it was 12 months or 18 months or something, but I remember I pulled out my eldest son first, and then I pulled my other son out not long after. So maybe I pulled my eldest son out at the end of the year, and then pulled my other son out 6 months later, I think, from memory. Because my eldest son had a teacher who was making him sit at the front of the class and practice his handwriting instead of doing the work. And he gave him this damning school report at the end of the year on the last day of school, so I couldn't even go up and say anything to him, saying, he needs to try harder, and if he put more effort in, he'd get better results, and all this stuff. And I was so angry because I had been practicing with my son, helping my son with his homework, and he'd been practicing really hard, and I knew that he'd been trying. And just because it wasn't translating into his academic records, it wasn't translating at school, the teacher just assumed that he wasn't trying. And then he's making him practice his handwriting instead of actually doing the work, getting further behind. And then showing off and saying, well, I've got kids in here doing year 6 work and they're only in year 4. And like, yeah, I just like, mate, you just don't know what you're talking about. It's like you're praising all the kids who are 2 years ahead, but that the kids who have some disability or are struggling, you just like stuff you're not putting in enough effort. So I pulled him out and homeschooled him, and my sister was actually homeschooling her son, so that is why I sort of knew about homeschooling. Otherwise, I wouldn't have even known that homeschooling was even an option. I didn't even know it was an option until my sister started doing that. So I did that. So yeah, I pulled my son out after that because I just felt like they just didn't seem to care. After my youngest got diagnosed, my eldest ended up getting diagnosed with persuasive developmental disorder, non otherwise specified, or something. Like, what a mouthful. Like, I can see why they changed the criteria to just autism, because I mean, whoever came up with that shitty diagnosis, like, couldn't they have just called it mild autism? But whatever. That's what he got diagnosed, which meant he was mildly autistic. And then he got diagnosed with ADHD. And it wasn't until many years later, like he was about 16, he finally got diagnosed with dysgraphia, or maybe 14, I don't know. He was mid-teens, he got diagnosed with dysgraphia. And I thought, this poor kid, like, no wonder he's been struggling with his handwriting for all this time. And, as a parent, you try, you spend money, you pack out thousands trying to get all these diagnoses, and then you end up missing one or something. And oh, it's heartbreaking. It's really, really heartbreaking. But yeah, that's the way it went down. So ended up pulling him out of school because he just was getting a rough deal at school, and he wasn't happy, because he was struggling. And then I pulled my younger son out like I said, I think about 6 months later, I was really angry again. Like, he was missing a lot of school because of his health. So that was one of the major deciding factors. But the biggest thing then was that when he was at school, he was a very, very bad asthmatic when he was a little boy. And like, literally, like, I'm talking run around for 10 minutes and can't breathe. Like, that's how bad his asthma was. So he had to have, I suppose he had exercise induced asthma. So he'd always have to have 2 puffs of Ventolin 10 minutes before he exercised, or he'd be coughing a lung up, you know. He'd be coughing and that. And so I had to really drum it into the school, like, my son has exercise induced asthma. He's a bad asthmatic. You've got to make sure you give him his puffer. And the teacher was all right. She's like, yeah, I'll do it. That's fine, because he didn't have the strength in his hands to do it. When he was in kindergarten, he had very weak muscle tone. He couldn't even open the car door to get in the car. Like, he had no strength. That's not the case anymore. He's taller than me, and he's, you know, pretty strong now and stuff. But at the time, that's what he was dealing with. But, so the teacher was doing it, and then she ended up going away, and apparently they had a substitute teacher for a while, and I think my son's asthma must have been getting worse or something, because I went up there to have a chat with them, and the substitute teacher was like, "Oh, I didn't know he had to have his Ventolin puffer," and I'm like, "Are you freaking serious? Like, this kid's getting sick." And you're not even giving him his puffer at school. Like, then you're going to blame me if he doesn't come to school because his asthma's flared up. And then when the teacher got back, I think she was away for a month. And then when she got back, I went and had a talk with her about it. And she's like, well, I did write in the book for the teacher to do it. Like, how about just saying, holy shit, I'm really sorry that happened. Is he okay? Or something, like, not just like palm it off like, well, I did write it in the book, it's not my freaking problem. That's what it felt like. And then and then and then she goes, well, he's going to be in year 1 next year, so he really needs to learn to do it himself anyway. All the other kids in year 1 will be doing it themselves. And I was like, my son has a disability, he's got weak muscle tone. Like, this is what I'm thinking. I didn't say anything. I was just flabbergasted at the attitude, because I'm like, if he could do it himself, there wouldn't be an issue. He would just be doing it himself. But he can't, like, he didn't gain that type of strength in his hands to be able to press the puffer down probably for another 3 years. Like, I started teaching him, you go do it yourself, but he couldn't do it for about, till he was about nearly, what, probably 8 or 9 or something, you know? And it's like, how hard is it to give him his puffer? Like, he's got a disability. But I can't remember. I think I was just so disgusted at that point. I just had enough. And I ended up just pulling him out as well, because I'm like, all I'm doing is just constantly arguing and begging with people. And I've had a gut full of it. And then, of course, you know, people don't understand, you know, like, people are like, oh, what's wrong with you? You know, you're the problem. No one else has all these problems, and you're always arguing with people. And it's like, well, yeah, I've got 2 special needs kids, and I'm trying to get help and make sure they're supported, and people just don't listen or take it seriously because they don't look disabled. Of course, I'm always arguing with people. So, you know, you get a real chip on your shoulder, because instead of just going, how can we help and support these 2 children with disabilities? It's too hard for everyone else. And so it's much easier to blame the mother and to blame the parent and say, well, you must be the problem, because then I don't have to acknowledge the fact that I have to make accommodations for your children. So, yeah, I was very bitter for many years, very just, even now, like with the NDIS and what they've done to my daughter, and they've not given my eldest son much funding, and we've got to go back for a review for him and for my other son, and you really just feel like you're constantly fighting an uphill battle and no one cares, you know? It just sucks, but I know I'm not alone in this. Like, unless you're in the disability community and you're dealing with it, you just don't understand how hard it is. But anyway, I pulled them out and I homeschooled them for a while, and we went through initially we did the ACE program, I think it was called, PACE or ACE, so it was ACE. It was a Christian private school, and they would send us the booklets in the mail, and they were so horrible. Like, it's like if Jesus has 12 fish and then he multiplies it to feed the crowd, how many more, there's 40,000 people in the crowd, how many fish does he have? Like, that, that sort of thing, and then you open up each booklet, there were booklets for each subject, but each subject was so concentrated with just talking about the Bible and everything. You open up the science one and God created the earth and this and that and blah 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 blah, and then you open up the maths one, it's like, if there were 12 disciples and one of them went away, how many disciples would be left? Like, obviously not, those weren't the questions, but it was very similar. And then you open up the English book and it's like talking about the Bible, and it's like, can we just you don't need to have that rammed down your throat. It was very, very, it was just too much. I call that brainwashing. I think that's brainwashing when it's at that level, So, and my son didn't like it. It was a lot of writing for a kid who had dysgraphia, and we didn't know he had dysgraphia. It was too much writing. And then I think we tried an online program, and I don't know, he just struggled. Then we ended up doing a mix of I ended up just making up the curriculum myself, which was cheaper, but it was more work for me and it was harder on me. But we did a mix of sort of unschooling and book work, and tried to incorporate all different sorts of learning techniques. Like, I can't remember them off the top of my head, but you've got people who learn well from listening, people who are more visual learners, and I think it's kinesthetic. I think like people who learn from touch and doing activities rather than just sitting there listening about it. So I tried to do a mix of all of that to sort of cater, just make sure you're sort of ticking all the boxes, I suppose. So I tried to do a mix of different stuff. And yeah, it was hard. Obviously, you got children having meltdowns and disabilities and that, but you just do your best. That's all I could do. And I will do another podcast or a video talking more about what I did do if I can. I did throw out a lot of the homeschooling stuff that I had, because when I finished homeschooling them, I was so relieved that I think I just threw it all in the bin straight away, because I'd had enough, because the boys ended up doing distance education in the end, because they were just struggling so much. And, it was hard. We went through a lot, and I went through another divorce, and that wasn't easy. And yeah, there was a lot of stuff going on. And then my youngest son had the pain of that, plus the fact that the pediatricians put him on a whole heap of different medications, and it's like a cocktail of medications. It didn't agree with him, and that's a whole other story. But you're trying to homeschool this kid who can barely even function because his mental health's been shot through the roof, and his whole nervous system's been shot through the roof at 10 years old because he's been put on a cocktail of drugs by the pediatrician. It was really heartbreaking what we went through as a family, but now fast forward, we're all doing so much better. I got him a private psychiatrist and got him put on the correct medication. But it's been tough. But my eldest son just completed a writing course last year, and he's so intelligent, he's so smart, and he's still deciding what he wants to do with his life, but he did do a writing course and he's been doing some writing. He loves to write, and trying to encourage him to do some further study this year. Same with my youngest son. He's looking at doing some study, but for me, a person's mental health and their happiness and their peace is more important than any of that. So that was the goal, none of us could be happy while my middle son was miserable and mentally unwell. And yeah, I don't know. It's such a travesty, these kids on the spectrum. Like, I feel like doctors and scientists have created medications, and if they don't agree with you, it's just, well, like, oh, well, stiff shit, pretty much. Like, my son had a really bad reaction to Risperdal and Lovin and Catapress, and I got told that only a small percentage of kids have a bad reaction to that combination of drugs. Then I had another pediatrician tell me that he never should have been put on Risperdal and Lovin because they interact. I don't know. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a scientist. I'm not a pharmacist. I don't have a clue. All I know is that all those medications nearly destroyed my son. And yeah, it nearly destroyed all of us. It was so hard to live with, and no one cared. I begged them to put him in hospital so he could detox from these drugs at 10 years old, and they're like, we're not going to put him in hospital. I said, isn't there a mental health facility or something? Like, what can we do? Because he's having withdrawal symptoms. He's having a reaction to all these drugs you've put him on. No one cared. No one would do a thing. It was beyond disgusting, and I just don't even know how. I don't know. Like, surely we're not the only family that went through that. Surely my son's not the only kid in the world that had a bad reaction to all these medications. But yeah, I don't know. It was so hard, but we got through it. I tried going through the public psychiatrist for him, and they did nothing. They gave him one appointment and it did nothing. And yeah, in the end, when he was 15, I got him a private psychiatrist, and he is amazing. He still sees him today, and he's put him on medication that actually works, and my son is doing well. But it was a roller coaster, and I just wish I could do more. I wish I could do something. That's why I'm telling my story, my son's story, because it's not right for that to happen. There needs to be better care. And some parents would have cracked under that pressure. Like, I nearly cracked, but I'm very tough, and I'm a fighter, and I don't take shit. And I spent many, 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 many hours on the phone yelling and screaming and bawling and crying and trying to get a resolution for my kids. But one person can only take so much. But anyway, it was just hard days. And I just think there needs to be a better protocol. Like, if you're a pediatrician and you put a child on medication and it sends them off their head, and then what? Like, that pediatrician then moved away, and then I had to then go through the hospital as an emergency patient. It was just, like I said, it was just years of on and off medications and trying to work out what worked, and no one seemed to be able to get it right. Nothing worked. No medication seemed to work on my son. So anyway, whatever. Those days aren't, like, those days have come to an end. Things are well now. Things are good. But it was tough. So I might just leave that at that. That was my first podcast, just telling some of our story as to how autism has affected our life in a negative way. But there are amazing, beautiful, good things about autism as well, like the way my children think, and they're so funny. And my son, the one who had all the reactions to the medication, he is the funniest person. Like, he's so funny, and and so quick and so smart, and he watches the 1% Club, and he gets all the questions straight away, gets a lot of the questions straight away when I'm still reading the question. Like, I'm still reading the question, he's got the answer. And I'm like, how did you get that? And he'd be like, oh, I don't know, I just know the answer. So, autism has its bad points and it has its good points, and I wouldn't change my children for the world. I love them so much. But the reality is that when you've got a child with a disability, then sometimes they get given medication, and sometimes it doesn't work, and sometimes you have to go through specialist after specialist to get answers and results, and sometimes going through the public system doesn't get you anywhere, and you have to go private because you get what you pay for. And it wasn't until I paid for a private psychiatrist that my son actually got the help that he needed. And The NDIS doesn't necessarily give people the funding they deserve or need. It's a very, very tough system. And again, with schooling, like I'm finding now that schools and people in general are so much more accepting now of autism than what they were a decade ago. Like a decade ago, I couldn't get any help at the schools. I just couldn't. I begged and I cried and nearly went bloody bonkers trying to get help for my boys, and I just couldn't. Whereas now it's very different. My daughter has gotten a lot of help from the schools, and it's a completely different world now than what it was 10 years ago. But the NDIS are still so far behind. Like, I hate the NDIS. They've got to be the worst thing. Like, some people swear by it, you know, some people have a good time with it, but I have not had a good time with the NDIS. So yeah, I'm gonna leave that at that, and next time I do a podcast or a video, I might try and talk more about how you can get into homeschooling and stuff, and just what my experience was and what resources I used, even though it was like a while ago. You know, my experience might help someone else to make a decision about whether they want to homeschool or in what way they want to homeschool. So yeah, that was my experience. So thanks for listening.